Hello there everyone, Mr. E here, and today I'd like to talk about Terminus Warrant, which is the keystone at the bottom middle of the Arbites tree, aka the bad keystone, the one that I don't really recommend playing with. And I'm going to go into depth on why that is today. I think there's a couple of builds that can actually use it to some impact, and I've been tooling around with one myself, but I think that this Keystone kind of misses the mark in terms of its class fantasy and also its power level as compared to its brethren, Execution Order, and Forceful. Now obviously, as if you've watched my rating videos on the whole talent tree, I rated Terminus Warrant at about a B tier, and those two are like multiple S's. Those are crazy powerful keystones. They synergize super well with what the Arbites is trying to do, and the problem with Terminus Warrant isn't that necessarily the buffs that it gives are underwhelming, it's that they're hard to realize in actual gameplay, and they are not exactly giving what you're promised on paper. It's a very deceptive keystone. So if you are currently using it, I'm going to make the argument to you today that I don't think it's very good at what it purports to do, and I think you have better options on the tree. And this is not me saying, by the way, that I think that the Arbites needs a buff. You know, if we bring the Terminus Warrant from a B tier up to an A tier, it's not going to make the class any stronger, right? It's going to make his worst keystone more on par with the two good ones that people are already using. So I think that this is just going to bring the playing field more level. I don't know what the realistic expectation is of them buffing this with any, relative soonness, but I'd like to put it out there because I think it's something that a lot of players have noticed, that this thing is kind of jank. Let's first go ahead and explain what this keystone is so we know what we're talking about, and also you should subscribe if you want more analysis of Darktide and all that good stuff. I really appreciate doing this for you, and I appreciate when you support me. Okay, so Terminus Warrant Terminus Warrant gives you stacks of ranged justice and melee justice. These stacks are granted every time you get a melee hit and a ranged hit, respectively. So if you see here in my gameplay display, on the bottom of my hexagon there, I have 17 stacks of melee justice and 13 stacks of ranged justice. Every time I hit an enemy with a melee attack, I consume one stack of melee justice and I get one stack of ranged justice. And the same thing applies in inverse. When I shoot an enemy and get a ranged hit, I cash in one stack of ranged justice and I get a stack of melee justice. Sounds simple enough, right? Okay, so what do these stacks actually do? Well, when you have stacks of melee justice, every hit you do is going to give you 15% melee damage and 25% melee impact until you're out of those stacks. And the important terminology here is melee hits. We'll come back to that in a second. The second thing is that when you have ranged justice stacks and you shoot an enemy, you're going to get 15% range damage and 50% range cleave and 50% suppression until you're out of range stacks. So like ostensibly in this situation, if I just keep shooting enemies until I'm out of these stacks, okay, now I don't have those benefits anymore. So that is that's using up all of those stacks for the range thing. And then now I would have to swap it with my melee weapon, and I have to get some melee attacks in here to get some ranged buff stacks back. And that's the interplay between the different buffs there. Sounds simple enough, right? Let's go ahead and take a look at the talents that hang off of this thing just to kind of fully explore the space before we get into discussing why this doesn't really quite work. So we have Dispense Justice over here. When you have stacks of range justice, you have 20% reload speed. So this means having any stacks of range justice like I do right now. So that's going to make my reloads, quite a bit faster. All you'd have to do is have gotten a single melee hit at all, and then you'll have a stack of range justice, right? So you can always get that as long as you have any stacks of range justice on your bar. Terminal Decree is going to be the opposite. As long as you have any stacks of melee justice, you get 100% melee toughness regeneration, and allies in your coherency replenish 25% of any toughness that you replenish. So this can be really good. The first thing is alright. 100% melee toughness regeneration means that when you kill an enemy in melee, like, this, you would gain 10% of your toughness back instead of the usual 5%. That's all that's saying. And I don't know why they had to phrase it so fancy, but that's all that's saying. It's not increasing any other toughness gains. But the second part of this is very interesting. Allies in your coherency replenishing 25% of any toughness that you replenish is quite impactful, especially for a class that has Castigator stance or Break the Line that can instantly replenish all of their toughness. So this would mean that your allies will also get 25% of their toughness back, assuming that you go from 0% toughness to full in the same amount of time. This also means that anytime there's a veteran shout or any other toughness applying effect in your vicinity, you're also going to echo 25% of that back onto your allies. So by itself, that little piece there is very, very appealing. You just need to have a single stack of melee justice on your bar to get this, which means you have to have shot an enemy with ranged kind of recently. So those are the little outside things, and then we got to talk about the diving deep. These ones, Obstinate and Writ of Judgment, require you to really commit. They require you to get up to a certain amount of stacks and then swap to a weapon and commit to holding out that weapon to get the maximum value out of it. So with Obstinate here, when you have 15 melee justice stacks or more, and you swap to your melee weapon, so like right now, currently, I'm on my melee weapon, so Obstinate is giving me an additional 15% melee attack speed while I have my weapon out. But, like if I do this, I can keep meleeing, and as long as I keep the weapon out, I still have that 15% melee attack speed. But right now, if I swap to my ranged weapon and swap back, now I don't have that buff. Because when I swapped to my main melee weapon, I did not have 15 stacks. I need to make certain that I have those 15 stacks active. There we go. And now when I swap to the melee weapon, I'm going to have 15% melee attack speed. So it's a really nice buff. 15% melee attack speed is really, really great. And the same thing applies to ranged. When I swap to my ranged weapon at 15 stacks, the next 15 hits or so, I'm going to get 15% ranged attack speed, which can be pretty good as well. Okay, so that's all right, and that's not that hard to trigger. You just have to play around that 15 stack requirement and really commit to using that weapon to get the full value out of it. Don't be swapping back and forth too often with that talent, right? And then Writ of Judgment is the deepest you can commit on this. So for Writ of Judgment to do its thing, you need to get to 30 melee justice stacks and then pull out your melee weapon. So this can be kind of hard to achieve with certain weapons, like this revolver would take all day to get there, right? But if I swap to a weapon that's a little bit better at this, like the Shredder auto pistol, and I give this enemy a good little spray in. Okay, almost got there. All right, there we go. So now I'm at 30 stacks of melee justice, and what this means is that when I swap to my melee weapon and start to go to town, I'm going to have 15% melee rending, and 15% melee attack speed, and 15% melee damage and 25% melee impact until I run out of those stacks, as long as I don't swap off of the melee weapon to go to ranged. So, you know, starting now, I'm going to have all those huge buffs, and it makes me quite formidable until I run out of those buffs. And the same thing applies in inverse to range attacks. Once I've meleeed enemies and gotten my range attacks, or my range stacks to 30, when I swap to my range weapon and pull it out, I'm going to have 25% crit damage and 25% weak spot damage until I run out of stacks or swap to my melee weapon. So pretty cool stuff, right? And also I would have 15% melee or fire rate and 15% range damage and 50% range cube and 50% suppression. Okay, so that's the whole Keystone. It's really complicated. It reminds me of the design of like Cassante versus Nasus if you're a League of Legends player from back in the day. This thing is like 50 miles long and has a million things going on. So what is the problem with this? Well, I can show it to you really quickly. Here is the problem in a nutshell, right? Say that I'm playing with like a normal weapon. You know, this is a pretty normal weapon that people use, the Mark 8 shotgun, right? I've got some enemies over here. I've got a bunch of melee stacks, so I'm going to start meleeing and cashing those in. And now I'm out of melee stacks, right? So no longer am I getting any buffs out of the melee. Now I need to swap to my ranged, and I need to get those melee stacks back. Okay, well. Okay, hold on. Let me make some more enemies. Okay, hold on. Make certain I'm hitting as many enemies as possible here. Okay, a few more. All right, there we go. All right, so it only took me about 15 shotgun shots in order to get those range stacks back up so I can get back to meleeing. And then here we go. Let's melee these enemies. Okay, and you can see the inklings of what my problem is here, right? That's the full duration that I can spend meleeing enemies before I run out of melee stacks. And here is the crux of the problem with the talent. there is a fundamental imbalance in how quick and easy it is to dump melee stacks versus how quick and easy it is to dump range stacks and build melee stacks conversely, because the talent is triggered on hit and not on like enemy kill or like swing or whatever like it could be. This means that because you can hit a maximum of 5 enemies per melee swing, you can get as little as 6 melee attacks out of 30 full stacks of this talent, which sucks because with Writ of Judgment, if you're really committing to Writ of Judgment going all the way down, that 15% rending is really best saved for large targets like crushers. And if you happen to encounter, like, you know, even a small pack of enemies before you get to find those crushers, or the crushers are at the back of the pack and they're coming towards you, you're going to use up all of your stacks before you even get to deal with them. And then you have to pull out your range weapon and shoot a bunch of ammo in order to get those stacks back. And fundamentally, these are not balanced. They're not fair and balanced. Because for one, it is way, way, way easier in this game to get hits with melee than it is to get hits with ranged. As you saw with the example with the revolver there. The revolver can only get a maximum of like 2 or 3 hits depending on where you hit the enemy. And there you go. So like you can see I can max out at 2 enemies hit per shot because that's how much cleave it has. And that means that I'm going to have to shoot 15 bullets in order to get 30 stacks of melee. So you will never get the melee effect out of using the revolver with this build, and this is what starts to really limit the usefulness of this talent, because it can only be effectively used, as my game is going to hang up here and crash I guess, but we'll go over here. It can only really effectively be used with a certain subset of weapons that have enough cleave and enough spread to hit many enemies with very little ammo, but there's almost no weapons in the Arbites arsenal that actually fit that bill. I mean, I could have used the Mark III, the Street Sweeper version of the Arbites shotgun. I think that's about the best weapon at possibly stacking these, but even then, you're going to have to be taking your shotgun and shooting it indiscriminately into hordes of enemies that you could very easily clear with your melee instead. And if you're at all interested in playing Havoc, the general logic on Havoc difficulty, since ammo is much rarer, is to conserve ammo wherever possible. You see a bunch of Poxwalkers? Don't shoot them and waste ammo. They aren't a threat. Go and melee them to death and save your ammo. But you need those melee stacks, so you have to be shooting large hordes of enemies with your shotgun in order to get those melee stacks. And then you piss them all away in like literally 2 seconds because that's how those melee hits work. So with that being said, explaining that Terminus Warrant doesn't really give us what's promised on paper. We aren't getting to have that cool like interplay between, oh, I'm going to get some melee attacks in, I'm going to get some ranged attacks in and get swapped back and forth. What does it give? Is there any builds that this thing is actually kind of good for? And my argument would be that it is ironically kind of good for ranged focus builds, but only ranged focus builds with a certain specific subset of weapons. Notably, the weapons cannot have too fast a fire rate or hit too many enemies every shot. So shotguns are out because they can hit, you know, dozens of enemies in one shot, so they'll eat all your range stacks too quickly. Fast firing weapons with low individual damage on each shot are out because they just aren't going to be getting a good effect out of all the buffs here before you're out of stacks. And weapons that don't feast on like fire rate or cleave or damage, all that stuff is out. So really what it's leaving us with are about 3 weapons in my approximation. Of course, one of them is the bolt gun, another one is the revolver, and a third one is probably the bolt pistol. These weapons all really like the critical hit damage and weak spot damage because they're good at aiming for heads and give big benefits and can crit with some frequency. These also really like fire rate because they're slow to fire weapons generally, and they also love range damage and cleave and suppression because they have those already, and those are being augmented even further. And they're also slow reloading weapons, so you'll get good benefit out of that reload speed. And remember, with a build like this, because you're going to have low amounts of melee justice stacks because it's so hard to hit multiple enemies with weapons like this, you'll have almost full range stacks most of the time. So you can go into boss fights and, you know, soften them up with your little shock prod and then, you know, kind of just take them out like that. And then you saw that only used like a couple of stacks of my, how did I get 17 stacks there? I might not oh, I only took 13 bullets. There you go. So that only took 13 shots. That is the effect that the range stacks can have on certain weapons. But this is the ultimate argument I want to make for this Keystone, is that because it is so specific and because it doesn't play very nicely with a good variety of range weapons, you are pigeonholed, one, into not using it for melee, because there's no range weapons that can generate enough melee stacks effectively without wasting a bunch of ammo necessarily. And two, it can't be used for ranged attacks because most range weapons just waste those stacks. They completely piss them away and they don't care about the benefits that it offers. So we're limited to making builds around this talent, around this Keystone, that are limited to like 3 range weapons, and it just doesn't really even care what melee you use. So in summary, what is wrong with Terminus Warrant? Well, it's a couple things, right? First of all, it's missing its idea behind the thematics, right? The thematics are supposed to be that you're hot swapping between ranged and melee, you're getting some range benefit, you're getting some melee benefit, and you're going back and forth pretty fluidly. That's at least, how I envision it, and I think how most players envision it, and it would be very, very cool for the class. The problem is that it is incredibly lopsided, and that is in a couple of fronts. Firstly, it is incredibly easy to build up ranged justice stacks because all you have to do is hit enemies with your melee attacks. And if you go into a small horde of enemies, you can melee them and you can get those melee stacks all consumed within 5 to 7 swings. You can hit up to 5 enemies per melee swing, so you'll eat all of your melee stacks up in the blink of an eye, and then you'll be capped out in range stacks. And here is where the second part of the problem is that it is very hard to effectively get rid of range stacks and thereby build melee stacks, and this only is even possible on a very small subset of weapons. So if you're using weapons like the revolver, like the bolter, like the single shot weapons like bolt pistol, etc., those weapons have almost no ability to generate melee stacks at all because they have a very limited number of enemies they can hit per shot fired. And then for any other weapon, like shotguns or auto guns and stuff, they have to waste a good amount of ammo in order to generate those melee stacks. So you have a twofold problem here. You have these melee stacks that are very, very fleeting. They can be consumed in a matter of seconds. And then you have the generating of those melee stacks being not only time consuming, but ammo consuming. They're very costly to produce. And it's sad because they are good, they have an effective set of buffs that we'd love to get to utilize, and they are underutilized because of the imbalance. So I have some solutions I'd like to propose to kind of balance this whole situation out, and hopefully, Fat Shark hasn't implemented any of my ideas yet, but hey, one of these days they'll have to listen to me, right? I'll just keep screaming into the void. Eventually it'll happen. So I think that the problem that I have is twofold. One, there is no generation of stacks outside of hitting or shooting enemies, and this can lead to having to waste resources or play in uncomfortable ways in order to get the benefits that you wanted going in. And so the first thing that we need to do is we need to cap the number of stacks that are removed per melee attack. This is primarily a melee issue. It's not an issue that ranged attacks are having. So if we cap the number of hits that are counted every time you swing for a melee attack, that will remove a lot of that complete draining of the melee stacks that has been happening with this talent and make it more of an attrition. I didn't know exactly what would be a balanced number here, but I think a cap of probably 2 is probably the most balanced. Even a 3-stack cap per attack would be a vast improvement over what we have currently, where the cap is like 5. You go into a horde, you hit 5 enemies, and you can drain your whole cache of these stacks in 6 swings. This would mean you have at least 10 swings into a horde where you get that benefit. This would mean you have 15 swings optimally, or like even in the worst case scenario when you have a big horde, and this would mean you will always get 30 full swings out of your 30 stacks, no matter how many enemies you're hitting, which might be a little bit much, but who knows. So this would reduce the rate that you stack up those range stacks as well, right? which I think is fine for many weapons, but don't worry, if you want to go range focus, I have something for that as well. Let's first focus on, if we were focusing on a melee focused build. So what I'd also like to do is make these nodes here, which currently are inclusive, you can choose both of them, I'd like to make them exclusive. I'd like to make it so you can choose only one or the other. And if you did that, then you would have a scenario where you can give these buffs that speak to, okay, if I want to be a melee focused or Terminus Warrant user, I'll choose this node over here, which normally gives this part right here. While you have stacks of melee justice, you gain additional melee toughness regeneration, and allies and coherence replenish 20%. You know, I read it earlier, right? But additionally, I would like to also add that it should generate 1 stack of melee justice per second. This is so that you don't have this general attrition on your ammo supply where you have to be wasting ammo or using it suboptimally in order to generate melee stacks. It'll be very nice to, path between rooms and not have to worry about the first thing I do when I get to the next room is pull out my shotgun and shoot the biggest horde that I can see 5 times in order to get any melee stacks at all. This will passively be generating these melee stacks so that you always have some, because they are so hard to generate otherwise. And then conversely, since we are nerfing the generation of ranged stacks by capping the number of melee hits that are counted per attack, we also want a way for ranged justice users, people who are going to specify into ranged justice using, or at least lean more towards that, to get extra range stacks. And that's what's going on over here. This is the normal part of the talent where you get 20% reload speed while you have range justice, and this is what I propose adding, which is generate 1 stack of range justice per second. This will mean that instead of having a situation where, okay, I want this range justice benefit applied to my autogun, my braced autogun. Well, in order to get 30 stacks, I have to go and melee a bunch of enemies, and now I've got my stacks. Okay, well, most of the enemies are dead because I just went and meleeed them, so what was the point anyway? This will allow you to just passively generate some stacks, and so you will very nearly always have some range stacks to fire and play your preferred way. And I think this is something that this talent is lacking, is, it does enable with these, sorry, I'm just scrolling off to the fucking side of the screen for no reason. It does enable still going deep and getting those, committing to getting 30 stacks and then going back the other way and getting those 30 stacks, but it also can enable playing to one playstyle, either playing to ranged or melee justice, and picking and choosing your playstyle. So I think that would kind of both alleviate the issue and allow for some more diversification and specialization within this Keystone. Now, I don't know if this would bring this Keystone up to being anywhere near as powerful as the others, but it would certainly make it more usable in the way that the game is currently, and it would make it from Arbites' worst Keystone by a quarter mile to Arbites' Keystone by like maybe 100 yards, right? So let's pause it there. We might come back to Terminus Warrant in the future, but I think I've said about all I can for the day. Let me know down in the comments if you have any other ideas about how this Keystone could be tweaked or changed, or if you just think it's great as it is. I really appreciate hearing from all of you, and I hope you have a really good day. Mystery out. Bye.